Today, I'm going to be discussing property from the anarchist perspective, specifically my perspective. And shout out to Silver Sword for this topic recommendation. But I want to combine the topic of property and power because they have been historically heavily correlated with their use and with their function. And if you look back historically in the rise and fall of empires and regimes, it's been a history of trying to achieve more property in regards to the amount of land that an empire owns. And when an empire is able to obtain more land, essentially what they're also obtaining is the resources that this land contains. So, for example, coastal geographical lands are more able to trade along seas and other regions, or specific passageways through mountains that become more popular routes for trade, all help establish a kingdom or an empire's ability to flourish and become more prosperous. But what's also contained in the land that an empire is able to obtain is people. And people are essentially the most productive resource that can be on a given area of land. And what I mean by that is people's intellectual capacity to hold knowledge and informations. People are what produce goods and services. So they're the ultimate resource in this Machiavellian perspective of maintaining an empire. You want more people. That would be ideal, because the more productive people you have in a society, the more prosperous the empire can become, and this helps contribute to payments towards the kingdom in the form of taxation. So in regards to property, much of it has to do with the land, but not all of it. Not all property is distinguished in land. I do want to mention that in society, there's two types of relationships. Primarily, you have voluntary relationships, which are anarchist in the sense that they don't need third parties to be created. And then you have hegemonic relationships. And there's one primary hegemonic relationship I don't think that can ever be withered away, and that is the parent-child relationship, where essentially when a parent has a child, that child becomes property of the parents. They are in a sense the authoritarian dictator over the child. Now, children can be neglected by their parents. Children can run away. They can become independent and free at much earlier ages than other children. But for the most part, when parents raise a child, they take responsibility and ownership over the child. Now, there's other hegemonic relationships, such as the master-slave relationship, but in Western civilization, that has gone away. And then there's also the state and citizen, or state and subject hegemonic relationship, where in a given territory, the state that exists says to its citizens that, hey, we are taking ownership over you, and we provide you certain services in the form of protection. This is the kingdom complex. And this is a form of a hegemonic relationship where the state tries to maintain its hegemony over the subjects. if you were to have an anarchist society where the services of insurance agencies in protection and fire protection and water service were offered by companies, not the state, then you could do away with the state. But the state incorporates its nationalistic and psychological tendencies and try to really establish themselves as a good, moral, and legitimate organization for most of the people in that territory. So, going into the anarchist philosophy, anarchism begins with the anarcho-communist, and they were much more popular in the 19th and 20th centuries. And one component of the anarcho-communist philosophy is that property for communists is something that should be abolished in regards of private property. Property needs to exist, but it should be collectively owned, where these communes can help bring about the most amount of prosperity and freedom for the most amount of people. Now, when you get into the Henry George philosophy, he was saying, yeah, everything can be privatized, but land should be publicly owned. It should have a single tax. This is he was a big proponent of the single tax on land. When you get into the anarcho-capitalist philosophy popularized by Murray Rothbard in the 20th century, a student of Rothbard, Walter Block, has the quote, "If it moves, privatize it. If it doesn't move, privatize it. And since everything either moves or doesn't move, privatize everything." So the anarcho-capitalists look at property as okay. Let's back up a step. John Locke raised the question of who owns you? Do you own yourself? And the anarcho-capitalists would say, yes, you in fact do own yourself. And if you can concede that point, where is the limit drawn of what is property and what is suitable for ownership? And essentially, they go into homesteading, they go into contractual agreements and title ownership of establishing that actually property is not just your bodily limits. It's actually the physical materials that extend from yourself. So the t-shirt I'm wearing is under my possession. It's under my ownership. I can trade it. I can sell it. I can burn it. But it's essentially mine, and what I choose to do with it, as long as I'm acting peacefully, non-violently, I can maintain my ownership over it. And if someone were to take it from me without my consent, then this would be a form of theft. This would be an aggression on my property, and this could be considered wrong or immoral from the anarcho-capitalist perspective. My professor had a really good point. He said, if you can defend it, you own it. So why does my house have a lock on it and I have the key to it? That's because I own it. I defend the contents within my home by the barriers of the walls and the ceilings and the door being locked over it. So I own that content. Now, if you want to make the case that the anarcho-communists make, that no, property is not something that can be privately owned, or else that is indeed theft. You have to understand that everything is owned by someone at some point. Right now, under statism, there's public roads. The oceans are not owned by any one person, but it's precisely because the roads are public and not private that the protest of 2020, in the summer of 2020, were mostly peaceful and not entirely peaceful. If they were privatized, then you wouldn't have the violence on the scale that occurred. Now, the anarcho-communists say that that there's a contradiction in the anarcho-capitalist philosophy that without the state, there would be no private property, because it is in fact the state that allows for the existence of private property. And the ancoms say, if you do without the state, then there would be no private property. But it's not entirely accurate. When you look at a cafe, that is a form of anarchism in action. Anarchism is a relationship. If someone goes in and they buy the coffee, there's no exploitation going on. Someone is paying for the services, and someone is receiving money in exchange for the services. So it's mutually beneficial. And in a way, this is the type of action that raises the standard of living for the people involved. So prosperity is more like a balloon inflating and getting bigger, rather than a pie, a fixed pie, or a zero-sum game, as some people think it is. Now, private property exists, and you can have security. It doesn't have to come from the state. Look at bars who employ bouncers and security guards to maintain the peace. They maintain the property being privatized. If it was public, you have what is called the tragedy of the commons, when people use up the services without the proper resource maintenance to keep a certain amount of the resources maintained in that property. But I also want to mention that property is not just physical. It's there's, what do I have here in my notes? You have digital property as well. So digital property is, in a video game, you unlock this new armor and you can trade it with another player on the video game. Now that property doesn't exist. It only exists in the video game. But it's an example of digital property. As well as you have video footage. Now, video footage is not a physical property, but say you have the CD, not Hunter Biden's laptop, but you have some form of digital hardware that can show video evidence of someone stealing a cookie on the countertop. You can't go back in time and show that person took the cookie, but you can look on the video footage to prove that this cookie was in fact stolen by this perpetrator. And then Bitcoin is another example. Bitcoin is a very unique case of digital property where it's entirely digital. It's a digital service that plays the role of a medium of exchange. And it's the hardest money that's ever been known, because more gold can be created in the world, as well as it's heavy, it's hard to transport, it comes from the earth, it's a commodity. Why do we need something so archaic and dirty as gold to play the role of the medium of exchange when we have something that's digital? If you look at transactions that occur on a market today, using a card, there's no physical property being transferred. It's just numbers that are being transferred in a digital space. So a lot of things are becoming automated as well as digitized, and I think that's the direction of many things, many more things to come. But Bitcoin is one of them. There's a hard cap of 21 million Bitcoin, each being divided to the 10 millionth decimal. So a factor of 8 decimal points. And you can't create any more Bitcoin. The nodes are decentralized around the world. Whereas, well, I don't need to go into the Federal Reserve having a centralized node. But there's another form of property that's intellectual property. So intellectual property are your thoughts and your ideas. And as we understand from Mises, that ideas are the basis for what constitutes human action. People act based on their ideas and beliefs and what they think will bring about a more satisfactory state of affairs over a less satisfactory state of affairs. And it's the actions of individuals that create societies. And it's, the most peaceful and prosperous societies that have the most ability for individuals to pursue their self-interest. Now, intellectual property, although it doesn't exist in a physical realm, can be influenced and controlled. And this goes back to the control over other people by the state as a director, where through his hegemony, his desire for hegemony, he uses tactics such as intimidation and coercion to control the resources of a society regarding the people, the subjects, to become more like pawns, as Mises uses as an example, where there's the director and then people become like pawns on a chessboard. Or Professor Huerta de Soto says people become like penguins and they just march around to the orders given to them. So this subjugates people. They're no longer free to think and act for themselves. They just have to follow orders. This is when your intellectual property is robbed from you. And going back to money, when you have a tax implemented on you, a tax on your home, this means that the government has a higher claim to your home than you do. You don't own it entirely. You pay other people to still use and possess it. Same thing with your income. You don't own your own energy and labor. It's entitled to another organization above you. And when I say that this hegemonic relationship between the state and its subjects still exists, and it did exist with the master and the slaves, but it was abolished in the 19th century. I think this state is a hegemonic relationship that will inevitably be abolished as more property becomes a lot cheaper and more abundant and easily transferable. Because the more that becomes digital, the less physical, the easier it is to transport. And this undermines the state. The state wants physical property, physical beings. It makes it easier to control. When something is not physically tangible, it's a lot more difficult to control. I think that's just a logical deduction. It's a lot easier for me to hold this pencil than a digital one or even an intellectual one in my mind. If I can control you in the physical world, then it makes my job a lot easier. But if you're free intellectually, if you're free digitally, from a Machiavellian perspective, if I'm your emperor, supreme leader, which I should be, no doubt, then it makes my job exponentially more difficult. So this is kind of the course I think humanity is on, is towards more freedom. And I don't want to make that a value claim. I think just from a descriptive claim, looking at history, it's exponentially gone towards more free societies, more peaceful ones, understanding individual human rights regarding property as something to be removed from the person is detrimental. So you need property rights to a degree that I don't think has really much been seen before. But I think it comes to money because money is the intermediary good of societies and people. If you mess with the money, you're messing with society. So to have the hardest currency ever existed, being invented 10 years ago. I think we're at the cusp of a new epoch, of a Renaissance 2.0, to bring the most amount of freedom and property to individuals, where people actually do own their labor, their wages, their homes, their property. And I think that is something to champion. So we will see in time. Thank you.